April 1939. A wooden crate is loaded onto two ox carts in Nagoya, Japan. The crate is wrapped in cloth, padded with straw, handled by the men who built it as if it were made of glass. The oxen begin their slow walk, 25 miles across country roads to the naval air station at Kagamigahara. The men who load the crate have not slept properly in weeks. The lead engineer, a 34-year-old named Jiro Horikoshi, walks part of the way beside the carts. He has spent 2 years of his life on what is inside that box. He has measured rivet tolerances down to fractions of a millimeter. He has argued with admirals. He has taken specifications that a rival manufacturer publicly declared impossible and refused to accept the word. Inside the crate is a prototype fighter aircraft. In 2 weeks it will take to the sky for the first time. And it will do something. The men who wrote its specifications did not believe was physically possible. That machine will become the Mitsubishi A6M. In the West, it will be known simply as the Zero. It will fly from the first day of the Pacific War to the last day. It will be widely credited with more aerial victories than any other Japanese fighter of the war. In its opening months of combat, it will be reported by Japanese naval aviators to have achieved kill ratios so favorable that Allied intelligence officers initially dismissed the numbers as propaganda. The exact figures are still debated by historians today. What is not debated is the reaction it produced. Allied pilots who survived their first encounter with a Zero came back, describing it the way frightened men describe ghosts. Something that materialized from nowhere, something that could not be held, something that was gone before they understood what had happened to them. And here is the thing that will haunt this story from the first frame to the last. The characteristic that made the Zero unbeatable in that April 1939 test flight. The obsession that Horikoshi built into every gram and every bolt. The design decision that separated it from every other fighter on Earth. That exact characteristic is what doomed Japan in the air. Not despite its perfection. Because of it. This is not a story about a plane that became obsolete. Every plane becomes obsolete. This is the forensic breakdown of an engineering philosophy so perfectly executed that it could not be fixed. A trap so elegantly constructed that it could not be escaped. And the paradox that aviation historians are still writing about today. How do you build the finest carrier fighter in the world and lose the air war? To understand the answer, we have to go back 2 years earlier, to a set of specifications that a rival company called physically impossible. And to a man who decided that impossible was simply a design constraint he had not solved yet. The year is 1937. Japan is 2 months into a full-scale war in China, and the Imperial Japanese Navy has a problem. Its current carrier fighter, the Mitsubishi A5M, is a competent monoplane, neat lines, reliable engine, but its range is too short. Its speed is too slow. And the deeper Japanese bombers push into Chinese territory, the more they need an escort that can go the distance with them. So the Navy writes a new specification. And that specification, by any engineering standard of the day, is insane. The new fighter must reach a top speed of at least 500 km per hour. It must climb to 3,000 meters in 3.5 minutes. It must have an endurance of 6 to 8 hours at cruise speed with a drop tank. It must carry two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns. It must be no wider than 12 meters, so it can operate from an aircraft carrier deck. And then the requirement that broke the room. It must be at least as maneuverable as the A5M it is designed to replace. Read those numbers again. They wanted a plane faster than anything currently flying, with the range of a small bomber, the armament of a heavy fighter, and the turning agility of the most nimble aircraft in the entire Japanese inventory. The rival firm, Nakajima Aircraft Company, put its best engineers on the problem. They ran the numbers. They looked at every engine option available in Japan. And then they submitted a formal withdrawal from the competition. The specification, they said, was physically unachievable. They packed up their drawings. They walked out. They went home. Jiro Horikoshi did not go home. Horikoshi was 34 years old when he was assigned as chief designer. He had graduated from the aviation laboratory at Tokyo Imperial University. He had spent time in Germany and Europe studying the aircraft design philosophies of the West. He was not a gambler by temperament. He was not a man who chased the impossible for the thrill of it. He was, by every account of those who worked with him, meticulous, almost to the point of obsession. A man who believed that if you understood a problem deeply enough, the answer was already there waiting for you. You just had to see it. He spent weeks analyzing the specifications Nakajima had rejected, and when he was finished, he agreed with them. Nakajima was right. The specification was impossible. Unless you made one foundational decision that changed the entire mathematics of the aircraft. The plane had to be lighter than any combat fighter ever built. Not somewhat lighter, not incrementally lighter, lighter in a way that had never been attempted before. Lighter in a way that would require throwing out things every other air force on Earth considered non-negotiable. Horikoshi's team drew a line through armor plating for the pilot. They drew a line through self-sealing fuel tanks. They drew a line through structural redundancy in the airframe. The steel plate behind the pilot's seat that could stop a rifle round. Gone. The rubber liner around the fuel tanks that sealed itself when punctured. Gone. The extra ribs and stringers that other designers added as a margin for battle damage. Gone. And then they went further. They obtained access to a new experimental alloy developed by Sumitomo Metal Industries in the mid-1930s. A material called extra super duralumin. Stronger than standard aviation aluminum. Lighter than steel, and so prone to corrosive brittleness that it required a special anti-corrosion coating just to survive operational use in the salt air of the Pacific. They engineered the wings and the fuselage as a single integrated structure to eliminate the weight of the joining fittings that every other manufacturer used. They flush riveted the entire skin of the aircraft, each rivet set with such precision that the surface felt like polished metal to the touch. They moved the engine mount unusually close to the cockpit, shortening the rear fuselage and saving still more weight. Every gram was interrogated. Every bolt was questioned. Every component was asked a single ruthless question. Does this keep the plane in the air or does it not? If it did not, it was cut. April 1st, 1939. The prototype is reassembled at Kagamigahara. Test pilots climb into the cockpit. And when the machine takes to the sky, it does not just meet the specifications the Navy handed Horikoshi, it destroys them. It exceeds the top speed requirement by more than 16 km per hour on its first flights. Its turning radius is unlike anything in Japanese aviation history. Its rate of climb is beyond what the engineers themselves had predicted. One pilot who flies an early test calls it the most responsive aircraft he has ever touched. The empty weight is approximately 1.68 metric tons. For comparison, the German Messerschmitt Bf 109, one of the finest fighters in Europe, at that moment weighs over 2 metric tons empty and has a fraction of the range. The American Grumman F4F Wildcat, which will meet the Zero in its first Pacific combat, weighs roughly 2.6 metric tons empty and over 3.6 metric tons loaded with a combat range of approximately 770 nautical miles. The Zero, with its external drop tank, has a combat radius approaching 2,000 kilometers and ferry ranges reported beyond 3,000. To put that range in plain terms, when American naval analysts first saw Zeros appearing in combat over China and the Philippines, they calculated the distances involved. And they concluded with genuine confidence that Japan must have multiple aircraft carriers positioned in locations Allied intelligence had not detected. There was no other explanation. No carrier-based fighter had ever flown that far. They were wrong. There was another explanation. The Zero was not supposed to be able to fly that far. Horikoshi had simply made it do so anyway. The Zero entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy in July of 1940. It was sent to China for combat evaluation, and in its opening engagements against Chinese Air Force fighters over the following months, Zero pilots claimed a string of victories so lopsided that Japanese after-action reports were initially dismissed by Western intelligence services as exaggerated propaganda. Modern historians continue to debate the precise numbers. What is not debated is what happened next. General Claire Chennault, the American aviator, commanding volunteer pilots against Japan in China, filed detailed technical reports about the Zero's performance. Range figures, speed estimates, turning behavior. His reports reached Washington in 1941. and they were quietly set aside. That dismissal was not stupidity. It was a reasonable response to a deeply unreasonable assumption. The prevailing view in Western military circles, largely unspoken but powerfully embedded, was that Japan could not have produced a genuinely world-class fighter. The country was seen as capable of competent imitation of Western designs, not of engineering innovation that surpassed them. That assumption would cost American pilots dearly on the morning of December 7, 1941. And for 6 brutal months after it, Allied fighter pilots across the Pacific would pay the installments on that mistake in fuel and blood. Remember this detail because everything that follows depends on it. Remember what Horikoshi took out of that plane to make it what it was. The armor, the self-sealing tanks, the margins for damage, the safety net that every other Air Force considered basic. Because what he removed did not just define what the Zero could do. It defined exactly where the Zero would eventually fail. It defined the shape of the trap Japan had built for itself, and the men who would eventually find those failure points, who would map them and teach them and turn them into doctrine. They had not seen a Zero yet. Most of them had not even heard of it. But they were coming. December 8, 1941, roughly 9 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Philippines, 45 Zero fighters from the Tainan Air Group lift off from an airfield on the island of Taiwan and turn south. Their target is Clark Air Base north of Manila. The distance is roughly 500 miles round trip. 6 hours in the air. American planners at Clark are aware that a Japanese strike is coming. They are not aware it will be delivered by single-engine fighters. That they believe is impossible. There must be a hidden staging base somewhere between Taiwan and Luzon. Something they missed. There is no hidden base. The Zeros strafe Clark. They shoot down every American fighter that manages to get airborne. They destroy bombers on the runway. And they turn north and fly home to Taiwan with fuel to spare. Among the pilots that day is a 25-year-old flight petty officer from Saga Prefecture named Saburo Sakai. He is already a veteran of the China campaign. He is the product of a training system that had accepted 70 candidates out of 1,500 applicants and graduated 25 from that class. Sakai finished first. Emperor Hirohito had personally presented him with a silver watch. On his first day of combat against American forces, Sakai shoots down a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk and destroys 2 B-17 flying fortresses on the ground. He is, in the language of his time and place, exactly the kind of pilot the Zero had been built to carry. The first 6 months of the Pacific War are everything the Zero's design promised. In the Philippines, in the Dutch East Indies, in Malaya, in Burma, Allied fighters fall in numbers that seem to confirm the worst nightmares of every intelligence officer who had read Chennault's dismissed reports and set them aside. Over the Indian Ocean in April of 1942, a formation of Zeros from Japanese carriers tears through British air defenses so effectively that the Royal Navy withdraws its heavy warships from the region entirely. Over the Coral Sea in May, over Midway in June, the Zero dominates every individual engagement it enters. American pilots who survive their first Zero encounter come back with the same helpless description again and again. It turns inside you before you can react, and if you try to follow it, you're already dead. But something else is happening in those early months. Quietly at first, then louder. Allied pilots are starting to notice things. The Zero, for all its brilliance, has boundaries. And those boundaries are invisible right up until the moment a pilot stumbles across one. The first boundary is speed. The Zero's magical maneuverability lives inside a specific envelope. Below, about 200 knots, roughly 230 miles per hour. It can do things no other fighter in the world can do. Above that speed, the ailerons, the control surfaces on the wings that make the plane roll, begin to stiffen. There is no hydraulic assist. The pilot has to physically muscle the control stick against air pressure that increases with the square of speed. At 250 knots, a hard roll takes real effort. At 300, test pilots describe the ailerons as almost frozen. The Zero that had outturned every fighter alive at low speed became in a high-speed dive one of the hardest airplanes in the sky to maneuver. The second boundary is asymmetry. The large three-bladed propeller generates significant torque, Combined with the Zero's extreme lightness, the aircraft rolls to the left far more readily than it rolls to the right. A snap roll to port happens in the blink of an eye. The same maneuver to starboard takes noticeably more time and force. In a dogfight, measured in fractions of a second, that difference is not academic. It is the difference between the pilot who lives and the pilot who does not. The third boundary is the dive. The Zero's featherweight airframe, so brilliantly optimized for low-speed turning, is structurally fragile under the loads generated by a high-speed dive. The aircraft carries a published never-exceed speed lower than the normal operating speeds of many Allied fighters. Push a Zero too hard in a dive and the airframe can fail. The wings can separate. Japanese pilots know this. They dive with caution. Allied pilots who discovered it turned it into a weapon. And then the fourth. The one that Horikoshi's obsession had built directly into the airframe. No armor behind the pilot. No self-sealing liner around the fuel tanks. A Zero that took a short burst from a heavy American machine gun did not just take damage. It caught fire. Allied pilots learned that the Zero was one of the most lethal aircraft in the air, and one of the most fragile the moment their guns actually found it. The trick was getting it into the crosshairs. The hardest thing in the world. But when you did, a short burst was often enough. The man who first turned these scattered observations into a teachable doctrine was not a scientist. He was not an engineer. He was a 36-year-old Navy pilot from Paris, Tennessee named John Thach. In 1941, before he had ever flown against a Zero in combat, Thach read a translated report from the fighting in China. He sat at his kitchen table that night with a box of matchsticks. He arranged the matches into formations of aircraft. He moved them across the tablecloth. He was trying to solve a problem no American pilot had solved yet. How do you fight a plane that can outturn everything you own? His answer was counterintuitive. He decided the trick was not to match the Zero's turn at all. That was impossible. The trick was to make the Zero's turn work against it. He designed a formation in which two Wildcats would fly abreast, and whenever an enemy fighter latched onto the tail of one American plane, the other Wildcat would turn hard toward his partner. The two aircraft would cross paths, and the Zero, following its target, would fly directly into the guns of the second Wildcat coming the other way. The Zero's greatest strength, its ability to stay glued to a target through any turn, would become the bait in a trap. Thach called it the beam defense maneuver. History would call it the Thach Weave. He tested it in mock combat with a fellow pilot, Edward O'Hare, in early 1942. It worked. When he briefed his squadron, some of the pilots looked at him like he was insane. On the morning of June 4, 1942, at the Battle of Midway, Thach and his 6 Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3 were escorting torpedo bombers when they were jumped by a formation of Zeros. Thach's radio operator was shot out immediately. A Wildcat went down burning. By every conventional measure, this should have been a slaughter. Thach called for the Weave, and in the confused chaos of that engagement, for the first time in the Pacific War, American pilots were killing Zeros faster than the Zero pilots believed possible. Saburo Sakai, who would meet the Thach Weave over Guadalcanal weeks later, would write about it afterward in his memoir. Japanese pilots were confused by the tactic. His immediate superior, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, came back from one of the first encounters shaken and furious. He had a Wildcat perfectly in his sights, he said, and then another Grumman was coming at him from the side, forcing him to break off, or die. The weapon, the Zero, had been built to use its turn, had become the bait of a killing box. The Thach Weave did not make the Wildcat equal to the Zero. Nothing in 1942 made the Wildcat equal to the Zero. But it broke the certainty. It told American pilots that the Ghost could be beaten. And that information mattered almost as much as the tactic itself. Some of you watching this had fathers or grandfathers who flew Wildcats in that war, or served on the carriers that launched them. If you have their stories, their squadrons, their ships, leave those names in the comments. Those specific memories belong to people, and they matter more than anything written in an archive. But Thach's tactic was still theory, confirmed in the chaos of a single battle. What the American Navy needed was not a workaround. It was a blueprint, a complete forensic map of the Zero's every strength and every hidden crack. And in the summer of 1942, that blueprint would come, delivered by a 19-year-old Japanese pilot who had not intended to deliver anything at all, who was in fact dead before the Americans ever found what he had left them. June 4th, 1942. The same day, American dive bombers are sinking 4 Japanese fleet carriers at Midway, breaking the back of Japanese naval power in a battle that will echo through the rest of the century. A completely separate drama is unfolding in the fog and cold of the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. It will make no headlines that week. Its consequences will reach into every American fighter cockpit for the rest of the war. Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga is 19 years old. In a service photograph taken before the mission, he looks directly at the camera with the quiet confidence of a young man who has been told he is flying the finest fighter on earth, and who has no particular reason to doubt it. He is part of the Aleutian Diversion Force, a secondary operation designed to draw American attention north while Admiral Yamamoto's main fleet moves against Midway. That morning, Koga launches from the light carrier Ryujo as part of a 3-plane section assigned to strafe the American base at Dutch Harbor. The attack goes as planned. Koga and his wingmen strafe the base, but during the pass, small arms fire from the ground. Defenses hits Koga's Zero. Specifically, the round severs the return oil line. Oil begins to stream out of the engine. If he pushes the throttle, the engine will seize. Koga reduces power and radios that he is heading for the emergency landing zone, a small island called Akutan, 25 miles to the east. A Japanese submarine is waiting offshore to recover downed pilots. His 2 wingmen follow him east, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Tsuguo Shikada. They circle above as Koga surveys the ground. He finds a broad flat area about half a mile inland from the shore. The grass looks firm. He lowers his landing gear. He begins his approach. And then Shikada on a second pass overhead sees something that stops his breath. A glint, sunlight reflecting off moisture, under the grass. That is not a firm field. It is a bog, waterlogged tundra beneath a thin skin of vegetation. There is no way to warn Koga in time. There is no radio channel to reach him with. Koga touches down. His wheels sink instantly into the wet earth. The nose pitches forward. The aircraft flips onto its back with a heavy splash. The impact snaps Koga's neck. He is killed instantly. Endo and Shikada have standing orders. Any Zero that might fall into enemy hands is to be destroyed. They circle the wreck. They can see the plane clearly. Upside down, half sunk in the marsh, they cannot see Koga. They cannot confirm he is dead. They cannot bring themselves to open fire on what might be a trapped wounded friend. They circle twice, and then they turn, and they fly back to the Ryujo, which itself will be sunk 2 months later off the Solomon Islands. Endo will later be killed in action in the Pacific. Shikada will survive the war and spend the rest of his working life as a banker. Koga's Zero lies in the Aleutian bog, upside down, undisturbed, for 36 days. On July 10, 1942, an American PBY Catalina patrol bomber is returning to Dutch Harbor. The crew has become briefly lost in the notorious Aleutian weather. They are navigating back to their proper course by dead reckoning. As they pass over Akutan Island, one of the gunners looks down through a break in the clouds, and what he says over the intercom is a sentence that changes the trajectory of the Pacific Air War. "Hey, there's an airplane on the ground down there. It has meatballs on the wings." The Rising Sun insignia. A recovery team is dispatched. When they reach the site and pull the aircraft upright, they are astonished by what they find. The Zero has spent 36 days upside down in a saltwater bog, and it is almost intact. The engine is undamaged. The instruments are readable. The airframe is structurally sound. Koga is still in the cockpit. He is given a respectful burial on the island. The Americans load the aircraft carefully onto a barge on July 15th. They ship it to Naval Air Station San Diego. Restoration takes weeks, and every technician who works on it comes away impressed by the engineering quality, the flush riveting, the integrated wing and fuselage, the obsessive precision of the construction. On September 20th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders climbs into a rebuilt Japanese Zero on an American airfield. He starts the engine. He takes off. He becomes the first American pilot to fly the Ghost. Over the next 4 weeks, Sanders will make 24 test flights in Koga's Zero. And every one of them is a document being written. Every roll, every dive, every steep turn. Sanders is measuring exactly what the Zero can do, and more importantly, exactly what it cannot. His report confirms every suspicion Allied pilots had begun to form in combat. The aileron freeze above 200 knots, the asymmetric roll, the dive limitations, and it adds a detail no one had discovered in the air. The Zero's carburetor-based fuel system, unlike the fuel-injected engines in American fighters, will cut out momentarily under negative G forces. If an American pilot pushes his nose sharply down into a dive, his engine keeps running smoothly. If a Zero pilot follows him with the same maneuver, the engine sputters. It comes back, but it sputters. For a second, maybe 2. Seconds are the unit of measurement in this war. Sanders' report is distributed across the fleet. A specific counter is now standard doctrine. A Zero on your tail. Push the nose down. Dive hard. Roll aggressively to the right. The Zero cannot follow at that speed. Its ailerons will freeze. If it tries to match your dive by pushing negative G, its engine will hiccup at exactly the wrong moment. And the right roll is always harder for it than the left. Every one of Koga's silent secrets is now a training bulletin. Marine Captain Kenneth Walsh, a young pilot from New York, would use that bulletin repeatedly over the Solomons. He would finish the war with 21 confirmed aerial victories, 17 of them Zeros. He would receive the Medal of Honor for 2 missions in August of 1943. Years afterward, he described the maneuver with the calm precision of a craftsman. With a Zero on his tail, he would push into a split S, nose down, full throttle. He wanted at least 240 knots, preferably 260. Then, as prescribed, he rolled hard to the right. Tracer rounds from the Zero flashed past his belly. He escaped. He wrote later in a plain sentence what the entire American fighter community understood by then. From Koga's Zero, he knew which way to roll. If he hadn't, he would probably have rolled left, and he would probably have been dead. One 19-year-old pilot who never intended to give the Americans anything had handed them a complete diagnostic of their most dangerous enemy. The aircraft that made it possible for Koga's crippled Zero to reach Akutan at all. That extraordinary range, that fuel efficiency, that featherweight airframe, was the same aircraft whose secrets now sat in a Navy report being read by every Pacific fighter pilot for the next 3 years. The Zero's greatest asset had delivered its most dangerous liability. But there is a second front in this war, invisible, silent, killing Japan even faster than the American Hellcats that were about to arrive. And that second front is being fought at flight schools inside Japan itself. Here is a number. In 1937, 1,500 Japanese sailors applied for the Navy's pilot training program. 70 were accepted. 25 graduated. Every one of those 25 was by definition extraordinary, selected from a pool wider than almost any military program on Earth. Trained for years before they ever sat in a combat cockpit. That system produced men like Saburo Sakai. It produced men like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the ace of aces. A gaunt, sickly-looking pilot from Nagano Prefecture, whom Sakai described as looking like a man who belonged in a hospital bed. Tall, perpetually ill with tropical fevers, ribs visible through his flight suit, and widely credited with 80 or more aerial victories, though exact figures remain debated by historians. His fellow pilots gave him a nickname, the Devil. These men were the product of the most intensive pilot training program in the world, and Japan burned through them like paper in a fire. The problem was structural. Japan's military leadership had planned for a short war. An elite corps of pilots, small in number, impossibly skilled, decisive results quickly. There was no reserve, there was no second tier. When Midway came, and the war did not end when the American Navy survived and began counterattacking across the Solomons, the irreplaceable veterans were left in the line, until they died. At Pearl Harbor, approximately 750 experienced Japanese carrier pilots participated in the attack. By October of 1942, 10 months later, roughly 400 of them were dead. Midway alone cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and 234 aircraft. But the men mattered more than the machines. Those carrier pilots had accumulated thousands of hours of flight time over years of preparation, and Japan could not replace them. The math was simply impossible. The Guadalcanal campaign from August of 1942 into February of 43 accelerated the bleeding. 0 pilots based at Rabaul flew missions to Henderson Field that pushed the outer limit of even the Zero's extraordinary range. 600 miles round trip, every day. The Japanese lost over 600 aircraft in that campaign, and with them the irreplaceable men who flew them. Saburo Sakai had his own day over Guadalcanal. August 7, 1942, the opening day of the campaign. He mistakenly attacked what he believed to be wildcats. They turned out to be SPD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise, slower than fighters, but equipped with a rear gunner. That gunner opened fire. A burst tore through Sakai's canopy. A bullet fragment drove through his skull. It shattered part of his right eye. It temporarily paralyzed the left side of his body. What Sakai did next has been told and retold. His own memoir is one of the only sources. So the specific details, the exact minutes of the flight, must be read as one man's account. According to that account, bleeding half-blind, drifting in and out of consciousness, he pointed his Zero back toward Rabaul, nearly 600 miles across open water, alone. He wrote later that he sometimes rolled the plane inverted to keep the blood from his ruined eye from flooding his good one. That when he lost consciousness, he would open the canopy and let the freezing air revive him enough to find the horizon. He nearly ran out of fuel on final approach. He circled the airfield 4 times before his vision aligned him with the runway. He landed. He refused medical care until he had delivered his mission report. The doctors at Yokosuka Naval Hospital told him he would be permanently blind in his right eye. They told him he would never fly combat again. He spent a year recovering, and then he was assigned to a training unit in Japan. What he saw in that training unit shook him. He wrote about it later with the quiet horror of a man who has seen the future. The new generation of student pilots were often young men who had been fast-tracked through the program. Sometimes they held higher ranks than their veteran instructors promoted through family connections. They were arrogant about their theoretical knowledge. They were incompetent in the actual handling of their aircraft. We could not watch for individual errors and take the long hours necessary to weed the faults out of a trainee, Sakai wrote. Hardly a day passed when fire engines and ambulances did not race down the runways, sirens shrieking to dig one or more pilots out of the plane they had wrecked on a clumsy takeoff or landing. The Zero was not getting worse. The men flying it were. And then in August of 1943, the Americans arrived with a new machine. While Japan was burning through veterans, it could not replace an American factory on Long Island, was preparing an answer. The Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, based in Bethpage, New York, had begun designing a new carrier fighter in 1941 under the leadership of Leroy Grumman and his engineering team. Every intelligence report on the Zero, including the data eventually derived from Koga's aircraft, went into the specifications. The result was the F6F Hellcat. 2000 horsepower to the Zero's 1130. A top speed of 380 miles per hour to the Zero's 335. Over 200 pounds of cockpit armor. Self-sealing fuel tanks. 6 heavy 50 caliber machine guns. And the Grumman factory that produced it would build over 12,000 Hellcats in 3 years. More airplanes than Japan built Zeros in the entire war. The Hellcat was not as maneuverable as the Zero at slow speeds. It was not trying to be. It was designed to be fast enough to dictate every engagement, armored enough to survive being hit, and powerful enough to turn any tactical situation into an advantage for its pilot. In the second half of 1943 and into 44, Hellcats flown by well-trained American pilots began meeting Zeros flown increasingly by men who had spent less than 4 months in a cockpit before being called combat-ready. The engagements that had been lethal for Americans in 1942 became lopsided in the other direction. Not because the Zero had changed, because everything around it had. And on the morning of June 19, 1944, every one of those compounding disasters was going to arrive at the same place, at the same time, over the same patch of ocean. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea, somewhere between the Mariana Islands and the deep blue emptiness of the Western Pacific. Two navies are converging on each other, and the men in the cockpits do not yet understand that what is about to happen will be remembered not as a battle, but as an execution. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commands the Japanese First Mobile Fleet, 9 aircraft carriers, roughly 430 to 450 aircraft. He has been given the strategic mission of a lifetime, Operation A-Go, the decisive battle, the moment where Japanese naval air power husbanded and rebuilt through 2 brutal years will break the American advance before it reaches the home islands. Ozawa is 58 years old, a tall, thin man with a reputation among his officers for quiet competence. He is one of the more capable senior commanders Japan still has left. And he is about to send his aviators into a wall. Across the water, Vice Admiral Mark Meecher commands Task Force 58. 15 aircraft carriers, 900 aircraft. Meecher is 57 years old, a weathered career aviator with a leathery face and the calm, unimpressed manner of a man who has seen too much to be surprised anymore. His pilots are on average better trained than they have ever been. His radar operators are better. His fighter direction officers are better. His ships bristle with proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells that did not exist 18 months earlier. Everything the Americans learned in 2 years of hard war is now sitting on those flight decks, waiting. At 7:30 in the morning, Ozawa launches his first strike wave, 69 aircraft, Zeros, dive bombers, torpedo bombers. They form up over the Japanese carriers and turn east. American radar picks them up at 150 miles. Think about what that number means. In 1942, the Zero had materialized out of thin air, ghosts appearing from fog. Now the moment Japanese aircraft climb above their own carriers, they are visible to American operators, watching green screens on ships they cannot see. The Hellcats on Meecher's flight decks have 14 minutes to launch climb to altitude and set up an intercept. 14 minutes. In 1942, they had seconds, sometimes not even that. The Zeros meet the Hellcats over the ocean at their operational altitude. And what follows is not a dogfight. It is a slaughter. According to most historical accounts, the first wave loses roughly 42 aircraft out of 69. Ozawa launches a second wave, 128 aircraft. American radar sees them coming. Hellcats intercept. The second wave loses 97 of 128. A third wave of 47 aircraft launches. Confused by navigation errors and bad orders, most of them never even find the American fleet. They wander in the sky, low on fuel, hunted by Hellcats. 40 of 47 do not come back. A fourth wave of 82 aircraft launches. Misdirected toward Guam by faulty coordinates, they arrive at an American-held airfield where Hellcats are waiting for them, already airborne, already at altitude. Of 82 aircraft, 73 are shot down. By the end of the day, Ozawa has launched roughly 326 carrier aircraft against Task Force 58. American Hellcat pilots and anti-aircraft gunners have destroyed close to 300 of them. Total Japanese aircraft losses across the 2 days of the engagement, including land-based aircraft and the ships lost in the American counterstrike, that evening, will reach approximately 480. American aircraft losses will be 123, and the majority of the American losses will not come from combat. They will come that night, when exhausted pilots low on fuel try to find their carrier decks in a moonless sea. Meecher gives an order that becomes legendary. Turn on the lights. Every ship in the task force switches on searchlights and deck floods. In the middle of a war zone, betraying their position to any Japanese submarine in the region, so that his pilots can find their way home. Many of them still cannot. They ditch in the water. Destroyers pick most of them up. Some are never found. The American aviators, watching the last aircraft come aboard that evening, gave the engagement a name of their own. One of them said what everyone was already thinking. He said it looked just like an old-time turkey shoot. The name stuck. History would record June 19, 1944 as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. That morning, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu returned to the flight deck of the USS Lexington. He was 26 years old, a Hoosier from East Chicago, Indiana. When he climbed out of his Hellcat, he held 6 fingers up toward Admiral Mitcher, watching him from the bridge above. 6 Japanese aircraft, shot down in 8 minutes, 360 rounds of ammunition. A cameraman snapped the photograph that would run in newspapers across the United States. Vrasiu grinning, 6 fingers raised, a young American pilot who had just confirmed in blood everything the training program and the industrial base and the 2 years of hard learning had built. On the other side of that photograph, in a Japanese aviator's memoir, written years after the war, was a description of what the day had felt like from inside a Zero cockpit. You launched. You expected a battle. What you found was a wall. American radar saw you at 150 miles. The Hellcats were waiting at your altitude or above it. The coordination was flawless. The shooting was precise and relentless. Everything you could do to survive turn, climb, dive was already anticipated. When you turned tight and slow, the Hellcat climbed away, came back at you from above. When you dove, it followed without effort. Because its pilot didn't have to fight his ailerons to roll. The only escape was to run, and you could not outrun a Hellcat. The Japanese Naval Air Force that limped away from the Philippine Sea was in every practical sense finished. The veterans who remained from 1941 and 42 could be counted on paper. The replacement pilots did not have the flight hours to matter. And the Zero itself, now clearly outclassed in speed, in power, in protection, had no successor waiting on any Japanese assembly line. Horikoshi's team had seen this coming, and they had been unable to do anything about it. Because the same design philosophy that made the Zero what it was in 1940 made it impossible to fix in 1944. Every attempt to add armor to the cockpit, every proposal to install self-sealing tanks, every drawing board sketch for a more powerful engine ran into the same brick wall. The airframe was already stretched to the limit of its structural integrity. Adding weight killed the turn. Adding power to compensate for the added weight required a larger engine, which weighed more, which killed the turn. The performance envelope Horikoshi had spent years creating through obsessive brilliance was by now a cage he could not open. The Zero had been perfected. And perfection in war is often another word for finished. There is a document that captures this moment more honestly than any battle report. In the final year of the war, as American B-29 bombers began systematically burning Japanese cities and Hellcats owned the sky over the home islands, Horikoshi kept a personal diary. He wrote in it with the flat honesty of a man who had stopped pretending. He wrote that most of the engineers who genuinely understood American industrial capacity had never actually believed Japan would win the war, that they had assumed throughout the fighting that their government would find some diplomatic way to end things before catastrophe arrived, that in the absence of any such move they were being driven toward destruction. The man who had designed Japan's finest fighter had never believed his creation would win the war. It was built to fight. The Zero's final chapter is its most disturbing. By late 1944, the Japanese Navy was running out of options. Its carriers had been sunk or scattered. Its trained pilots were nearly gone. Its aircraft factories were being bombed. And its senior officers were looking at charts that no longer offered any conventional path to victory. In that vacuum, an idea emerged. Not initially from the top of the command structure, but from the middle, from officers and even from junior pilots who had watched Hellcats systematically kill their friends and could see no other way to strike back. If a Zero could not shoot down a Hellcat, it could still fly, it could still carry a bomb, and it could still hit a ship. The Special Attack Units, kamikaze, the word means divine wind, a reference to the typhoons that had scattered Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century. In the final year of the war, roughly 2,363 Japanese Navy aircraft would participate in kamikaze missions. Of those 1,189, just over 50% would be Zeros. Horikoshi's masterpiece, the beautiful, brilliant featherweight fighter he had wanted to make into something noble, was ending the war as a guided bomb, carrying young men whose flight training had been measured in weeks, aimed at American destroyers off Okinawa. And here is what is worth pausing on. The kamikaze program was not in its origin an act of fanatical certainty. It was the answer of men who had already lost. It was the tactic of pilots and mid-level officers who had watched the Hellcats and had done the math on their own aircraft and their own training and their own dwindling numbers, and who had concluded with a kind of terrible clarity that no other tactic gave them any chance of hurting the enemy at all. The most beautiful fighter Japan had ever built was chosen for suicide missions, in part because its own pilots knew better than anyone that it could no longer do the thing it was built to do. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the Devil, Japan's ace of aces, widely credited with 80 or more aerial victories, though exact figures remain debated by historians, did not die in a Zero cockpit. On October 26, 1944, he was flying as a passenger aboard an unarmed transport aircraft over the Philippines. He was traveling to pick up replacement Zeros one day after escorting the first organized kamikaze mission over Leyte. 2 American Hellcats intercepted the transport. It went down. Nishizawa was killed. He was 30 years old. The greatest Zero pilot in Japanese history died in an aircraft that could not fight back, on a flight he had not chosen. Saburo Sakai survived the war. He lost the vision in his right eye permanently. He never flew combat in a Zero again after his August 7th flight from Guadalcanal. He returned to a defeated Japan. He became a Buddhist. He opened a small printing shop and made a point of employing veterans who could not find work anywhere else. In the early 1980s, he traveled to the United States. And in California, he met Harold Jones. Historical sources differ on the identity of the American gunner who fired the burst that nearly killed Sakai over Guadalcanal. Sakai believed for the rest of his life that it was Jones. The two men met, they exchanged gifts. Sakai brought with him the flying helmet he had been wearing that day in 1942. It still had the hole in it. They spoke for hours. Sakai died in Japan in the year 2000. He was 84 years old. He had just finished a formal dinner at an American Navy base. He collapsed of a heart attack. There is a small strange piece in the way the war ended for both of those men. The pilot who lost his eye, and the enemy he came decades later to see as a human being, not as a target. That kind of peace is not the way most stories from that war end. Most of them just end. The verdict, the final audit. The Zero was, by the metrics of 1940, the finest carrier-based fighter ever built. Its range was revolutionary. Its turn was lethal. Its construction was a masterpiece of engineering precision. Captain Eric Brown, the British Royal Navy's chief test pilot, after the war, one of the most experienced test pilots in aviation history, flew a captured Zero. And he wrote afterward that he did not think he had ever flown a fighter that could match the Zero's rate of turn. He said it ruled the sky completely until the middle of 1943, and yet Japan lost the air war decisively. By June of 1944, the Naval Air Force was broken. By the last months of the war, its pilots were flying suicide missions in the same aircraft that had terrorized Allied flyers 3 years earlier. Why? Not one reason. A cascade of reasons, all flowing from the same source. Horikoshi built the Zero around a philosophy of war that assumed agility was the supreme virtue of a fighter, that the ability to outturn any opponent was the decisive characteristic, that everything else, including the pilot's own survivability, could be traded away in service of that turn. That philosophy was correct in 1940. It became a cage by 1943. Because the same featherweight lightness that created the turn also prevented the structural upgrades that would have allowed the Zero to keep up as the war shifted. The plane could not be fixed, because fixing it would have destroyed the thing that made it what it was. The Japanese Navy pilot training system was built on the same philosophy. Elite by selection, exceptional by development, irreplaceable by design. It was correct for a short war, catastrophic for a long one. When Midway and Guadalcanal burned through the veterans, there was no second tier waiting behind them. The system could not scale, because it had never been designed to scale. It had been designed to produce Saburo Sakai. It could not produce enough of him. And the Zero itself, the machine that had to be light to be magnificent, could not carry the armor that would have kept those irreplaceable men alive. Every pilot lost in a Zero that caught fire from a single burst. Every veteran killed because a bullet found an unprotected fuel tank. Was a pilot the training system could not replace in less than years. And Japan did not have years. Horikoshi wrote near the end of his life a sentence that captured everything. All I ever wanted, he said, was to make something beautiful. And he had built something so beautiful that the men who flew it into combat believed they could not be beaten. He had built something so precisely optimized that it dominated the Pacific for 2 years. He had built something so perfect that it could not be improved. And in the war that followed, it was the plane that could adapt, the plane that could carry everything. Horikoshi had refused to include that survived. The Zero, unable to change, watched itself become obsolete while it was still in the air. Tadayoshi Koga is buried today, most likely in the Chidoriga-Fuchi National Cemetery in Tokyo. Among 223 unidentified Pacific War remains, no one knows for certain which grave is his. The 19-year-old, whose crash in an Aleutian bog handed American analysts the complete blueprint for defeating his own country's greatest fighter, will probably never be definitively identified. The Zero he was flying was eventually destroyed in a February 1945 taxi accident at an American airfield. A Helldiver dive bomber lost control on the tarmac and struck it. The Zero broke apart. Its pieces were scattered. A few museums today hold fragments. The Alaska Aviation Heritage Museum has a small piece of the airframe. The National Museum of the United States Navy has some of the gauges. The aircraft that shaped the entire second half of the Pacific Air War ended its existence as spare parts in a museum drawer. Jiro Horikoshi lived until January of 1982. He received the Order of the Rising Sun from his government. He wrote his memoir. He lived long enough to see his war judged and to see young Japanese filmmakers begin turning his life into stories. When Hayao Miyazaki, decades later, was making the animated film that would eventually depict Horikoshi's life, someone told the director about the line Horikoshi had once written, that all he had wanted was to make something beautiful. Miyazaki said later that when he heard that sentence, he knew he had the heart of his film. That is the epitaph. That is what the Zero was. It was beautiful. It was the most maneuverable carrier fighter the world had ever seen. And the engineering obsession that made it beautiful. The absolute uncompromising, brilliant refusal to accept any weight that was not necessary was the reason it could not survive the war it had helped to start. Think back to the beginning of this story. To the wooden crate on the ox cart in April of 1939. The men who walked beside it did not know what they were pulling. They believed they were delivering a fighter. They were delivering a paradox. A machine so perfectly designed for one moment in the history of air combat that it could not exist in the next. If Jiro Horikoshi that day could have looked forward 6 years, if he could have seen that the aircraft in the crate would end its career carrying 19-year-olds into the sides of American destroyers off Okinawa, would he still have made it as light as he did? Would he still have refused every gram of armor? Would he still have built the Zero? That question has no answer. It cannot be answered. And that is why more than 8 decades later, the story of the Zero is still being told. The plane that flew from the first day of the war to the last was doomed by its own first great success. The obsession that built it could not save it. Because in 1937, Jiro Horikoshi had solved exactly the problem Japan had asked him to solve. He could not know yet that the problem was about to change. If this forensic breakdown gave you something to think about tonight, hit the like button. It helps this kind of history reach the men who care about getting it right. Not the headline version, the actual version. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because the story of how American industry answered Japanese engineering is one of the most important and least fully told stories of the Pacific War. And if you knew someone who flew a Wildcat off Guadalcanal or a Hellcat off the Lexington or served on any ship in that theater, please leave their name in the comments. Their squadron, their ship, those specific memories belong to real men. And in a world that forgets very quickly, they matter more than anything else in this video. Thank you for watching.